March 16, 2005, in her apartment in Stellenbosch, South Africa, Inge Lotz, a 22-year-old student, was discovered murdered. Her passing shook the neighborhood in what seemed to be a locked-down, safe apartment. Initially, the evidence pointed to Vyver, her lover. But many were left to question whether the right person was ever held accountable after a controversial trial riddled with holes and twists. The case remains among the most puzzling, unsolved mysteries South Africa has today. Stellenbosch is a scenic college city, well known for its historical appeal and wineries, as you may know. Beneath this peaceful surface, however, many of its inhabitants are haunted by a high rate of crime. Inge had taken every measure to guarantee her safety. She lived in the Shiraz secure neighborhood, which featured high walls and electric fencing. Security bars had been fitted inside her house, and a remote access system controlled the gates outside. She became the victim of a horrific close-range attack, even after these steps. Let's briefly examine Inge's life before we get into what happened afterward. She was not just another college student. Inge Lotz had achieved academic distinction as a bright young woman. She was heading toward finishing her master's in mathematical statistics. She was not only a brilliant pianist and singer, but also a top student. Warm, full of life, and energetic were how her friends described her. But what Inge had been fighting with her relationship with Fred beneath this flawless veneer was unknown to anyone. From a wealthy farming background, Vyver, 22 at the time, was a successful financial expert. Like Inge, he had finished university with great distinction, and they had comparable goals and interests. Though their relationship was young, it was intense. In reality, Inge had told her mother only months before she died that she had a future with Fred and even thought about marriage. Their relationship contained hidden problems, however, that were impossible to overlook. Fred was very religious, coming from a strict Christian church with conservative opinions on relationships. He was a devoted member of his people and urged Inge to live by his beliefs. He did not support premarital intimacy. These pressures bothered Inge, who was not as strict in her beliefs. Friends of Inge noted she felt trapped and even stifled in the relationship. For some time, the tension between Inge and Fred had been rising. Only hours before her death, they had a furious quarrel. That afternoon, she had written him a letter she would never again get him to read. Inge went about her usual day that afternoon. She had lunch with her childhood friend Wimpy Boshoff after hearing a lecture in the morning. It was over this lunch that Inge told Wimpy that her marriage with Fred was failing. They had fought that morning. She wasn't sure they could fix things. Still, Inge appeared to have changed her mind later in the conversation, saying she still desired to marry Fred by the end of the year. What seemed like a turning point hinted at the events that would follow later in the evening. Inge had returned to her house by 1:15 p.m., having arrived to repair her damaged balcony tiles, which had been broken when her new sofa was delivered a few days earlier. Some contractors arrived and Inge let them in. Then she had a quick phone conversation with her mother. At 1:36 p.m., she texted Fred, expressing her longing for him and how wonderful her meal with Wimpy had been. These were the final things Fred would hear from her. Following that, Inge went to a nearby store to grab a burger and rent a DVD. She returned to her apartment, changed into her pajamas, and relaxed on the sofa to unwind. The TV played, the magazine lay open on the floor in front of her, and she probably never even saw her attacker approaching. Fred started to get uneasy around 10:18 p.m., worried because he had been trying to reach Inge all evening. His memory still held the argument they had early in the day, and they were going to get together later to discuss. She wasn't picking up her phone now. Fred phoned Inge's mother, who had not heard from her either. Fred became more suspicious. Hoping Inge was okay, he asked his neighbor, Christo Pretorius, to go over. Christo reached the apartment complex at about 10:30 p.m., but no one answered the intercom. After trying many times without success, he called a neighbor to let him in. Apart from the dim television, the flat was gloomy. Christo turned the knob after knocking on the door, but got no answer. The door was open. Forever, he would be tormented by what he saw inside. Her head was drenched in blood, and Inge's limp corpse was sprawled on the couch. Christo first rushed to a nearby neighbor to request emergency assistance, but the harm had already been done. Inge passed away. The police arrived soon afterward, and the crime scene painted a bleak picture. With what looked to be a hammer, Inge had been struck at least 47 times in the head before being bludgeoned to death. She had also been stabbed several times in the throat and chest. The attack's violence suggested it was personal. There were, however, other strange facts. Inge's belongings, including her purse and phone, were undisturbed. There were no indications of forced entry into the flat. The murderer didn't appear to be after anything. Instead, it seemed they had arrived for something else, something much more serious. Still resting on the kitchen counter, Inge's phone never got another call or text. On the coffee table was an open DVD case. The DVD was still playing, indicating that Inge had been assaulted while relaxing, possibly without warning. Forensic analysts later confirmed that the murder weapon was probably a hammer and discovered a red towel and blood splatter in the bathroom, suggesting the killer had tried to clean up. But there was one important piece of evidence, a bloody footprint found in the bathroom. The authorities realized that this print, together with more evidence, could help them find the murderer. Fred soon came under suspicion. With multiple witnesses supporting his attendance at work in Cape Town from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m., his alibi seemed flawless. But there was a critical gap in his timeline. Fred's whereabouts were unaccounted for between 3:30 p.m. and 5:15 p.m. This 105-minute window raised doubts. Police had a theory they could not ignore. Fred could have left his office, driven 29 miles to Stellenbosch, committed the murder, and returned to Cape Town within this brief time. Searching Fred's apartment, they found a sports shoe matching the bloody shoe mark at Inge's crime scene. They discovered a fancy hammer beneath Fred's automobile seat as well, a present from Inge's family. Fred admitted he owned the hammer, but said it had never been used. The investigators now had a lot of indirect evidence pointing to Fred. Then there was the fingerprint discovered on the DVD case. It matched Fred's, a devastating piece of proof positioning him at the scene of the crime. Something strange then occurred. 2 weeks after Inge's death, a 17-year-old drug dealer by the name of Werner Carolus came forward, admitting to killing her. He described the scene in great detail, even including the couch, a fact that had not been revealed. Still, his confession quickly started to fall apart. Initially, he claimed the murder had occurred on a Saturday, although Inge had died on a Wednesday. When taken to the complex, he couldn't even recognize her flat. His narrative was unclear. Later, he admitted to being high when he confessed. The police dismissed him. The investigation then turned back toward Fred. The case had turned into a media show at this point. Though there was no solid evidence, the prosecution was sure Fred was their man. They thought the murder was motivated by Fred's controlling nature and his strict ideas about relationships. Friends of Inge said Fred was possessive and envious. There were worrying signs throughout their relationship. Though they seemed suspicious, Inge had told friends about bruises on her arms she claimed were from the gym. Fred's behavior set off more alarms after the killing. Saying it was too personal, he declined to present Inge's letter to her parents. Juanito, on the other hand, gave her mother, Juanita, a small letter that appeared totally out of character. Fred was arrested. His trial started in February 2007. In South Africa's history, it became one of the most widely reported cases. Though Fred's defense team was not giving up, the prosecution depended mostly on the shoe print and the fingerprint found on the DVD. They argued that the shoe print evidence was unreliable and the fingerprint could have come from a glass rather than the DVD case. Fred's legal team also questioned the prosecution's timeline. Experts testified that Fred could not have gotten back to work so quickly after driving to Stellenbosch, committed the murder, cleaned up, and returned to Cape Town in just over an hour. The trial lasted for months, and as it progressed, the case began to fall apart. The police had messed up important pieces of evidence. In fact, they had even failed to preserve important pieces of evidence, including the DVD, which had been returned to the rental store. Fred was eventually cleared of all charges in November 2007. The judge expressed sympathy for Inge's family, who would never get the closure they deserved, and blamed the police for their careless case management. Following the trial, the Lotz family brought a lawsuit against Fred for emotional damages, but they eventually dropped it. Fred won a false charges suit against the South African police in 2010. 3 years later, however, the judgment was reversed. Still open, the case remained unsolved. The actual murderer, whoever they were, was still at large. Years afterward, in 2014, amateur researchers Thomas and Calvin Mollett released Bloody Lies, a book that brought up the question of Fred's innocence once more. Letting Fred go free, the prosecution had made a big mistake in their judgment. Although they tried, no fresh evidence was found and the case was closed. Almost 20 years later, the mystery of Inge Lotz's passing still exists. Was Fred innocent or the victim of a failed investigation? The Lotz family still mourns, their questions unanswered. For a young lady with a bright future, Inge's death became a symbol of a broken criminal justice system that left her family and the community without closure. What now then? The reality is still unclear. Fred's mistakes in the police work led to a false accusation. Is he actually guilty? And who did it if Fred didn't? The mystery persists and gets only more complicated with time. Share your ideas in the comments, like the video, and then subscribe for more real crime stories.